For the listeners at home, who I'm sure are just following the character relationship arc of Roslet Tanner and poldec-tonteg with assiduity, whatever. They're following it. We were in Louisiana. That was like some True Detective shit, actually, where we were. The first True Detective, by the way, not the True Detective women talking recent one, which also sounds terrifying. But we were eating together in Landry, in New Iberia, Louisiana. And we were there eating various, fruits of the sea. Not from the sea, I guess from the muddy water in Louisiana.
From the swamp.
Let me paint the picture. The musical accompaniment is a Zydeco band. The band used extremely loosely. It's basically two, I'd say, late 70s couples. That sound right? So they're basically doing essentially what amounts to Zydeco karaoke in this seafood restaurant, which is, by the way, extremely wholesome. It's just so great. And so that's going on. And I'd say half the crowd was over 65, let's say. And then there was some young people, us included, very young. And then all of a sudden, they start playing the Cupid Shuffle, which I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with. Let's put it away. It's an urban song. It's like the Macarena of our time. It involves a coordinated dance, like a synchronized dance. And so we're just sitting there. I turn around and there are just literally on the dance floor, probably 8 to 10 elderly people doing this line dance in this seafood restaurant. And then Roslet and I...
They got off their
ass. Oh, they got off their ass.
And worked.
They did it. They worked. It was extremely wholesome. My wife was overcome with patriotism for this great nation of ours.
Well, I think she was crying.
She was literally crying. She's like, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Oh, shit. Dimitri has entered the chat.
Hey, guys.
So, Roslet Tanner, do you know what DeFi even means?
Yeah, I mean, I know what the acronym means, but this is one of my least known areas. This is all
the least known. So yeah.
So DeFi is just the financial instantiation of Web3, which is it's unfair that term's been bastardized and VCified, because to me it's a serious term. It just means disintermediating traditional gatekeepers of how you access core things like compute or financial infrastructure, or even cloud storage, say Filecoin. And Urbit's the way to circumvent the gatekeepers of the internet and how information is stored. And DeFi is just simply the way to access financial infrastructure in a disintermediated way, in a peer-to-peer way. Is just kind of the more direct way to put it. And there's an ideological benefit to it, and there's also an economic one. So you don't even need to be a Puritan libertarian guy who just doesn't want banks to know about his stuff to, in the long run, to have it win. But in the near term, it wins because it's more robust. You can't get gate-kept out of it. You can't get gate-kept out of it. You can't be censored out of it. And it removes a lot of those, you could say state and money kind of conflicts of interest out of things. And that's more the ideological tilt, the libertarian one. It's just an inherently political technology because of who it removes out of financial supply chains. You can't take banks and the state out of money and expect it to not be inherently political.
Have them be happy about it, yeah.
Yeah, and have them embrace it. That's just a non-starter, and I just feel that needs to be understood by the industry in general, more so when they some guys who are really based at their hearts, like Ryan Selkis, who's we just need more lobbyers, or more Republicans are getting elected. I'm dude, don't get me wrong, I'd rather have them elected than the Kamala Harris tribe. But it's just getting there on the scenic route, and it's a fundamental conflict of controlling soft power. So that's the ideological lens. And then from the economic one, even if you're kind of indifferent about, you're not necessarily anti-state, like most Asians, frankly. I've been surprised at how much they don't share that American, firebrand. They don't. They're fine trusting their government. They really are. That's not even a huge selling point for them, it seems. But what we're doing is removing, you could just view bankers as JavaScript running really, really, really slowly and expensively, performing tasks that are just, long and, they got to pay them a lot. We're incrementally taking out, out of performing these, like all of the costs of a bank, compliance department, HR, those bankers, those are embedded into the fees that they charge people. Mm-hmm. And we have taken all of that out with blockchains, which are just massive decentralized databases. So over time, like right now, it's not necessarily more economic, like with gas fees, and we're still scaling. So we're not at like the pinnacle of that yet. But over time, to me, it's like axiomatic that this will also be superior economically, just by virtue of what we're removing out of that supply chain that initially needed to get paid to, like bankers, legal, compliance, all that shit. The regulation is being enforced, or the operations are being enforced and implemented in code. So over a long enough time, once we scale this, I also think it's economically superior too. So you don't even need to be like a libertarian anti-state person, I think, to embrace this eventually, because it'll just be a more efficient system we're building. That'll take a little bit longer to get up and running, but to me, it's inevitable for, both of those reasons. And I also just think it's superior from a cost standpoint too, eventually.
Okay, so that's very good. That was very kind of succinct. Rosalind, does that sound? Are you? Can I sign you up for this? Are you down with the DeFi?
Yeah, I'm down with DeFi. I think like it is interesting just hearing you speak about it. Like there are so many obvious reasons why this would be counter to obviously it's counter to the whole traditional industry, but there's many different layers to why they would be against this and why there would be many roadblocks, not only for the financial incentives, political reasons, all of this, but also just like the sort of fake make work economy of all these unnecessary roles out there. That's just, it's going to be a tough knot to untie.
Yeah. And a good way, I think, to frame it as well is like, globalism outsourced the periphery, the factory worker, the lower tier, person, and moved them to China. What blockchains do fundamentally, and what DeFi does, is it outsources the middle. It takes even something like, any middleman like Airbnb or Uber. I mean, all they are is a matchmaker, and they take their cut when they matchmake. And that's what banks do too. They're matchmakers between financial transactions. And when you take matchmakers, which are corporations for a lot of this stuff, they provide real services. They're not parasitic, but we will render them not nearly as useful as they were. And that's going to cut into them. They're not going to like that. They'll try to embrace a little bit like BlackRock's doing with, they want to tokenize everything and what have you, but like it's not accretive to their profits, what's going on here. And it's certainly not accretive to the state's control of anything. It's just not. Like the very nature of it is not. Like, why would you build an inefficient database by design? What's the point of that? Like, hey, let's make this thing harder to situate and control. It's because no one can censor it or manage it like they're accustomed to doing. And so, yeah, they're gonna definitionally hate that. They're gonna create a bunch of bullshit reasons about why. They won't say that. They can't say that. They'll fall back on esoteric interpretations of securities laws and what have you, and all the games. Crypto's racist. It hurts the environment. It doesn't matter. Just pick a reason out of a hat. That's why they're gonna hate it and fight it. But it's a losing battle eventually. But it'll be a tough slog in the interim.
It's interesting to think about, like, you might have a more sophisticated vocabulary for this, but like, let's call them intrinsic and extrinsic rationale for financial intermediaries or something like that. Or no, let's call them the necessary and the accidental. Meaning necessary is kind of logistical stuff you mentioned, like actual services that are being rendered, discovery of counterparties for transactions, real stuff, quote unquote real stuff. And then there's the accidental, which is that, just rent seeking. Like, I like to be in the middle of these things. I went down the Michael Lewis rabbit hole. We've talked about this before. It's like, which of those books, but a couple of them mention, like, essentially all these investment banks literally get paid just to like be maintained in the good graces. Like, you don't ever want to like be on the outs with, I don't know, whatever, Lehman Brothers. You just don't. So you just pay them some money, right? And so it's kind of like there definitely is a cartel, I don't know, racket type thing, which, that's kind of value neutral. That's just reality. Right? Yeah. So it's interesting to think about, though, like the relationship between those two things. Like, if you got rid of all the, let's say, necessary stuff, right, would the accidental stuff still exist or find some way to maintain? I'm just kind of interested in what your thoughts on that are.
I'm not sure I guess you can tell by how I answered if I fully understood the question. Banks should sort of be almost seen like the military, and that they are sort of a de facto arm of the state. The state doesn't tell them everything they should do, just like, it's not like Congress is telling people in the military where to point their guns or how to do stuff. Like, they have an autonomous element to them, but they're like sanctioned financial arms, basically of the state. They create essentially all of the money. Like 97% of the M2, the money that exists, that consumes resources, is generated by banks. And the remaining 3%, I believe, is just physical currency, which definitionally comes from the Fed. But like, they make the money supply, and they do so under the allowance of the state.
Just briefly, how does a bank, make money?
Yeah. So honestly, it's going to be the answer is going to be so simple. You're going to think you're being too much, but I'm not. Like, they literally just mark up the account. Like all of everything we ascribe to how the Fed just prints money is actually how banks do it. Mm-hmm. And by that I mean they have a certain amount of assets or collateral. It's not reserves anymore. The reserve requirements are zero, so they don't even need to hold those anymore to give out a loan. And they basically do some economic analysis of, does this make sense to give this loan? But then when the process of creating a loan creates money, and it creates a new deposit, it creates more reserves in the system. But that's just all that happens. They literally just mark it up. And this was something that was never like, if you go into textbooks, they'll have like, the fraction of reserve theory of banking. There's a handful of other like theories on banking. And what's funny is, like, you don't need a theory for this. You can just go to the bank. Look, it's an operational question. It's not some flowery academic one. And that's how economists treat it. Like, there's a guy named Richard Werner, who's a professor of banking. And he's one of the few like guys who you could put an economics hat on that I actually like respect, because he's very like brass tacks. And he's like, he went to a German bank and he said, I want a $200,000 loan, but the process of this is I'm studying this. I want to see literally your systems. Yeah. I want to see if one balance goes down when the other goes up. I want to know, like, what the fuck technically is happening here. I don't care about theory anymore. And they just mark it up. It doesn't get pulled out of bank accounts. Like, as concretely as possible. Like, it doesn't get pulled out of reserves that the Fed gives the banks. Like, they don't use those. They don't use anything else. And that's what banks do. They make the money supply based off economic activity. And when you see things like interest rates being low, that tells you the demand for money is low. And that tells you, that means economic growth is low. And that's the only reason interest rates would ever be low, is because inflation and economic growth are low. And the banks lend less in those situations because there's less economic prospects. But to answer your question directly, that's how they do it. They literally just mark it up, do it under the sanction of the Feds, which allow them to do that.
Got it. Okay, so basically what the Fed does then is, like, doesn't throw them in jail for fraud or something for doing such a thing, right? Like, they just allow them to do it, right? Because if I do that, that would be fraud, right? I'm assuming, or something. Like, it would not be legal.
It'd be counterfeiting, right? Like, it's like, where does the money come from? It comes from a sanctioned entity almost, because, like, there's nothing stopping. Well, that's only partially true, and I like not to derail this, but the Eurodollar market is literally a bunch of offshore banks that the Fed has no oversight over at all doing this. They print dollars everywhere all the time. So domestically, that's what happens. That's how the dollars are made, and it does have to be approved by the government, by Congress. Again, this isn't like a Fed thing so much. It's just it's the government granting the banks the ability to do that. And all the Fed does is accounting optics. It just swaps things around. It doesn't make assets. When the bank does that behavior, it creates new balances and new assets. Yeah. When Congress spends, it creates new assets by virtue of the bonds it puts into existence. When the Fed does everything it does, there are no new assets made. Like, almost literally ever. It's a swap. One thing dies, another thing comes to life. There are some very, very small exceptions to that, but they're not the things anyone would really care about.
Okay, so this is actually kind of my weird rambling question. This is actually a concrete example, right? Which is that I feel like sometimes when we talk about technology related to all this stuff, like blockchains and whatever Urbit can do, and just all the actual whatever software enablement, that's concerned primarily with replacing the logistical aspect of all these weird things. But that's not really the bulk of it, right? The bulk of it is these larger scale policy. I hate to say it, but literally, like, the definition of political, actually. Yeah. Maybe you might be an exception, but overwhelmingly is concerned with, like, the logistics. Like, how is it physically possible or whatever? You know, I mean, logistically, operationally possible to maintain a ledger and blah, blah. And less so with like the political element. So that's my impression from looking at it, is you might be one of the only people who looks at it holistically. But I was wondering if that's true.
Yeah, I mean, mostly not, which it kind of, I think that it's kind of a good thing. Like it speaks to, I don't want to call it like naivete, though it like officially is, but that has a connotation that I don't like. They're just genuinely here to build cool shit. Like they're like, hey, this infrastructure, like we can now provide peer-to-peer transactions in a way that's like, this is great. This is a cool technology. Most of them are inspired by that. I mean, there are people that are here for like Ponzi's and pumps, but I'm like the builders, though, I honestly think are here to like build stuff, make money, and it's a cool domain. But no, they overwhelmingly just look, they think it's the same thing as any like third industrial revolution technology, like the internet. Mm-hmm. But this is a new tech that we just have to get the state to understand. They didn't like emails at first. I'm like, emails didn't take anything from them. You know, like the very nature of every single previous industrial revolution was accretive to the state and to individuals. It was like, it was a win-win because it was made things more economically efficient. It also allowed people to, you know, simplify and streamline their lives with certain things. Like the fourth industrial revolution is the first one that is actively detractive to the state in every capacity almost, by its very nature, because its nature is to circumvent and disintermediate intermediaries. You know, who are the intermediaries? It's everyone that is not going to like this, and they have a lot of firepower. So it's, a lot of them don't think about it this way, but that's because they're like just like genuine builders and stuff. And even the guys who have political tilts to them, like Nick Carter, Ryan Selkis, Eric Voorhees, even, who I think he'd probably actually be totally on my end. But I see them like still viewing it from like a lobbying perspective, or like, hey, we're going to get the House and the Senate, and if Trump gets in, he likes crypto, now we're good. It's just like, that's just a ridiculously myopic framing, I think, that just also takes these people at face value and doesn't understand what they represent as this like pulsating mass that operates in its own self-interest. And it's not that.
Well, and it sounds also like they still believe on some level in the overarching system, or they believe that there is no alternative to that system, and so they're going to play by whatever rules they can.
Kind of. It's kind of a Schoolhouse Rock understanding of the system, which
it's true. If we just get the right bills in there. I mean, that's the thing is like, and that's also, I mean, not to just totally riz you up, but I can't be stopped. But like, I think what I like about your approach is this is about power fundamentally. And the rationale is mostly post hoc to who benefits from the system. It's not like people kind of arrive at the answer for how monetary policy and, you know, et cetera is gonna be based on some sort of like sense of reasoning. It's that someone has an idea how it needs to be to enact certain kinds of power things. You know, and that sounds kind of whatever, like grad student, but I mean, you just want to blow the shit out of Russia. I mean, like someone wants to blow the shit out of Russia. Someone's going to find out how to make that possible, and they're going to paint it however they got to do it. Meaning it's not just a matter of like they don't have the right calculators or they don't have the right blockchains and shit. It's like, no, dude, like people just have a lot, maybe existentially riding on how this thing works now. They're not just going to go quietly into the night there.
Yeah, and they're waking up to it now with, you know, they didn't give a shit about us previously, you know, and when ETH came out at first and all this, because they didn't see it as a threat. And now they're going out, you know, now you see them really waking up to it, and they're not even going out, and people are continue to be bemused about, they're not going after the scams, they're going after the serious stuff. What the hell? It's like again, like there's embedded information in that. Yeah. Why would you go after the serious stuff? The scams don't matter. They don't threaten anything about control or soft power. And they're going to go after a lot of the fulcrums of the things that really matter, you know, and pumpy scam, whatever, doesn't really matter. Like, we know the only thing they went after on Luna was a project called Mirror, which let you trade stocks on it. Yeah. And they didn't like that. They didn't give a shit about the Ponzi mechanisms of Luna. No one looked into that. No one cares.
Yeah.
They cared about Mirror, this nothing little project that lets you trade S&P and NASDAQ stocks on it. Oh, we don't like that because an insider trade and whatever. And that's, you know, there's a lot of embedded information in what they go after, and it becomes not confusing at all once you understand the motivation there. And, you know, you see like this transparently psychopathic behavior from the SEC where they even get sanctioned by judges. It's like, you just lied. Like, that's not what that means. You were dishonest about all of this. And a Utah judge sanctioned them, and a couple of attorneys there got fired. And like, I don't know what else ways to like expose how this arm of the state is behaving. It's a completely in its own self-interested thing. It doesn't care about any kind of bending over backwards you do to say, hey, look, it's not a security now. Like that it doesn't matter. Like they're going to pick another reason to make it a security. Like they're a hammer, you're a nail. Like you're not going to make yourself less a nail with what you're building here.
I'd like to see that, you sort of like have you go on the internet, how do I launch a shitcoin? And it's like, here's your how you test checklist. And it's like, I'd like to go see you be like, I checked all these, whatever. I checked all these boxes. Why am I being nailed? It's like, well, because, exactly. Because you're getting hammered because you were the nail. So actually that kind of leads to my next question, which is, you kind of already started in on this, but, given that we think that this is not purely a technology adoption, is like you said, it's kind of a form of conflict, let's say. What are the next moves on the side of the incumbents likely to be? So I'd be interested to know what you think about that. What does that look like?
I think they will do a series of things to try and scare, because that's all they can, because they don't have, and this is part of why long term I'm white pilled and short term I seem like I'm like black pilled. It's because they don't have the resources to go after everything. Like for this, and this is the analogy I draw on like some of the essays are right. Like the U.S. military is basically undefeatable against traditional adversaries that, Russia, China, Germany, like that's why the U.S. is the U.S. because they win wars. And they won wars with very traditional adversaries that occupy land, they're centralized, it's very identifiable. And they lose now to Vietnam, Afghanistan, to guerrillas that are vastly inferior in any traditional way. They're also completely illegible from a normal standpoint and just they can't take them down. Even when they know the general location they're in, they lose those wars. That's basically in a war of exhaustion and of attrition because these other entities have, a more dominant motivation and they're just hard to take out. We can't take out guerrillas that persist. And that's what go after Goldman, Deutsche, Fidelity, big centralized entities that have compliance departments, occupy buildings. Let me speak to your CEO. Let me speak to your head of risk, whatever. They don't have the resources to go after everybody. They're just not built for this. So this is the guerrilla analogy here is that we are, Vietnam farmers, so to speak, because we're diffuse, we're illegible, and we're global. We're not even in one little Southeast Asian country. So you're not going to win that war. It will be lost eventually. But in the interim, they're going to fight, and they're not going to fight fair. And to go answer your question directly, I think they're going to fight by targeting very high-level people that are kind of, regulation by enforcement that inspire fear, like maybe going after Hayden Adams, who's the head of Uniswap, or the guy who's head of DYDX, who just stepped down as the CEO, which I thought was curious. Antonio, I forget his last name. They'll go for probably high-level optic targets that scare people. And I just think you'll see more and more of a drain of U.S.-based crypto talent just leaving when they start to see that, like, this is not going to be taken favorably. And the only way it is if you completely capitulate and, like, make it a Fed chain and make it, like, a censorable KYC. And then what's the point at that point? Why are we even doing this at that? Go do a normal broker at that, if you're going to do that. So I think that'll eventually kind of be shown that if you want to exist in the U.S. and probably the West overall, I expect most of the West to follow, any vassal of the U.S. to probably have similar rules, at least in the midterm. But I think they're going to try and do a lot of high-level scare tactics with some bigger names that really kind of send a chilling effect. But I think that only chills people outside of the U.S. to keep doing this because, a lot of talent in crypto is global. It's in Asia. It's in, Baltic states, Russia, Turkey, places that if they're not friends, if they're not outright enemies of the U.S., they're not necessarily like friends. El Salvador is obviously hitting high above its weight, so they'll go to places like that and keep doing their thing. Yeah,
I mean it's really interesting to think about that. Like, since there's no counter institution, there sort of is, but it's the surface area is a lot wider. I mean, it sounds weird, but it's almost like a more primitive level of enforcement, right? Because you're just actually just intimidating just people. Instead of just like finding Deutsche Bank, you're just going to intimidate some random nerd who pushed some commits to fucking Tornado Cash, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is like, it's kind of interesting. It's like anyone who thinks we're getting more civilized, I think is mistaken, actually.
No, rules of this stuff, I think, are evergreen. And yeah, it's I think that's exactly how they're going to do it. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say this is like sort of. I mean, you mentioned the Uniswap thing. Yeah. So one thing that we've been working on at Urbit is making it possible for you to have a front end. If you're the consumer of any of these DeFi services, to have a front end that's served from your server, right? Because it's obviously the most obvious. All these things are putatively decentralized, but everyone goes to app.uniswap.com, right? It's just
Right.
you just have a very real level of centralization at the DNS level, let's say, at the domain level. And so one thing we've been working on a lot is just getting more of these services kind of hosted on the front end, on your own front end. So, you get rid of at least one choke point there. So I'm kind of, I mean, that's the thing that we're really, keen on, because that's something that's pretty straightforward for us to do. But I'm wondering kind of like if you think that, what kind of technological advances do you think could help in this I'm thinking more on the user side, honestly, because I think that like a lot of that's who the bulk of the farmers are, right? Is just like users. They're not the actual developers. So I'm interested to know kind of what you think about developments in that arena.
Yeah, I think, I wrote this in, I think, the most recent Generations of War piece I just put up in my blog, that I don't think we'll get to real decentralization out of any ideology. We won't get puritanical guys, complaining online or something. Like, we're going to get there because we have to, and we're going to get there when these front ends get actually aggressively pursued. Because like before, we were like, yeah, whatever, no one really cares. It's kind of centralized because it works and what have you. Yeah. I think that attitude will shift and I fully expect cloud providers to eventually get targeted the same way banks do. Yeah. I wrote this last year, and they've already actually started doing this for cloud providers for AI. And I think it's just inevitable that they'll do it for crypto and like node operators, anyone using AWS. They're going to start treating us, you're enabling money laundering, whatever excuse they want to come up with. So when that happens, like front end access is going to be like, oh shit, how are we getting to this now? Because like now no one wants to host this. Cloudflare saying no. And then I think we start to care about the file coins and the Urbits and the Arweaves and the guys who are letting you use the operational stuff to get to this infrastructure, that are building it in a decentralized, robust way that is impervious to this. That's when they start to matter. So yeah, the front ends, being hosted on Urbit would be amazing. Some are on Filecoin now, but not all of them. Yeah. And I think we'll truly see a push there, and a push to like Urbit's value more so when we start seeing access to these things becoming a bit annoying or like troublesome. We're like, wow, I can't access this front end anymore because it's literally been seized by the DOJ. Yeah. So like, where do you go? You got to learn what Urbit is. You got to learn what Filecoin is. And that's kind of what, like, no one does this. We're not going to get big adoption because we have a lot of base guys who like the fact that it's decentralized. We're going to get adoption because like, wow, we need this. Like, exactly. This is a tool of necessity fundamentally. And like, necessity is the mother of invention. And we're not like at full necessity yet because we're not like at full state warfare yet, but we're getting visibly more and more there. Yeah. And, the front end access is going to be a huge choke point for that. And, I could see Urbit shining extremely well there. I think it's a huge funnel for Urbit.
It's a funny thing just to like, Cassandra type shit, It's very obvious to Urbit people that the way the internet is, I wouldn't even say constructed really so much as used, is just obviously vulnerable to these kinds of choke point attacks, right? I mean, DNS in practice is basically what, like Cloudflare, It's like, there's like these things, I mean, and everything is on AWS or GCP. It's like you're just a sitting duck. And I think it's interesting that people kind of assumed the terrain doesn't move. I guess you continue the military example. People kind of assume that you're fighting on the same terrain all the time. And they don't appreciate that the terrain itself is always moving, right? So when like 5 years ago, no one sees any obvious problem with this. I don't know, 7 years ago, like if the Daily Stormer gets taken off of Cloudflare, everyone's like, oh, well, I'm not the Daily Stormer. So, next question. And, if you're an Urbit head, you're like, dude, if they can do it to them, they can do it to you. And the criteria for doing it is going to go from like being just an absolutely noxious person to sharing COVID facts to transferring some UCSD. It's like, or USDC. It's like, these are the goal posts can just shift, yeah, so it's going to be really interesting to see, and I think that's one of those things where Urbit continues to try to be better, but also it's like we can kind of just stay where we are and wait for the world to get worse. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I kind of do think in a way that's true. The same way like more people came onto Bitcoin during the Canadian trucker stuff and the seizing of those assets. People, like a lot of normies got woken up to like, oh whoa, like this bank account like is just completely exposed to like a socialist government that thinks it controls, that wants to censor speech, so it'll do with financial assets. So through that bad event, like Bitcoin got more adoption, and Bitcoin's certainly not getting any better, right? It's actually very
Yeah.
So like we'll continue to see growth from certain walks and this is part of what like Urbit has a very natural constituent that's also inherently political. As they censor and go after certain people with political speech or transactions they don't like, they're going to come our way, and we should be open to that, and I think we should be speaking to that. And yeah, I do think a lot of the volume and growth, a lot of growth will come our way just by virtue of the other side being awful and not being able to help us, because they don't know, they have no other playbook besides censoring things to say something. Like they don't engage on any other like domain than that. And that will force people to realize, hey, this is why we're building this inefficient databases right here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think part of that's interesting just from a business perspective. It's like, this is changing, but you just have like, I think a whole generation whose minds have been ruined by kind of like YC consumer garbage type startups, where they assume that the only way to compete is on like ease and friendliness and, this kind of like usability. But you know what I mean? It's just like making something like that's a little bit faster or shinier or slippier or whatever. And it's like, no, actually, that's just one way to compete, and it's a widely held belief that your thing has to be slicker to win, but that's a very, very tenuous advantage, right? Because like maybe I use Google Docs today, maybe I use Notion tomorrow, maybe I use Airtable. It's like these people have they're not in, But if you're using Urbit because the kinds of transactions and stuff you're doing literally cannot be done otherwise, it's like you're not going anywhere. And that's a really good moat. People don't think about that.
Yeah. The web, and that's like Web 2 versus that's Web 2 versus Web 3. It's also like the third industrial revolution versus the fourth. Like all of that tech you just described is like internet based Web 2. The domain is just being incrementally faster, more efficient, whatever. It's not fundamentally changing the substrate of the plumbing of how this happens, because no one's ever. I mean, we just haven't. It hasn't really been the domain we focused on because we really didn't have the technical ability to do that. It's kind of like it'd be like when in the 1990s, be like, why don't we just stream these into our homes? Like, why doesn't Netflix exist yet? Well, you just don't. The internet wasn't there yet. And like once we started getting like computers and internet speed hitting a sufficient amount of abilities, then hey, in 2007, 2008, we got a little crop up of, well, actually, we can do this. And I just think it's a natural development of one. Separating money from state in a way that, people, I think inherently, especially in the US and West, seem to have a ideological belief in. Yeah. And also it's just a superior economic system too, I think fundamentally. It's just a huge selling point because, it's axiomatic that the more intermediaries you remove out of a supply chain, the more value is retained by both parties. Like to me, that's just a canonical law. And like right now, gas fees, people laugh. It's like, but over time, once it gets there, I don't see how that's not true, and how taking all the, the legal compliance and all that other fluffy stuff that we pay for to create a concept called hardness. And hardness is a great notion created by a ETH dev called Josh Stark, where we do things that try to make the future certain or predictable in small ways. Yeah. And a certain form of like hardness we have now is like legal, which allows us to have property rights. And, certain things that banks do allow us to assume things will happen if we agree upon them. And the legal system and the financial system provide like a certain amount of hardness that let us operate confidently. But now we're replacing that hardness with code and computers and things that don't need all this money to be supported and all these huge exorbitant costs and banker salaries. And so that's why I think over the long run, we win both ideologically and we win economically.
Well, so have I talked about this book with you? It's called Violent Entrepreneurs. Have I talked to you about this?
No, I haven't heard that.
It's one of my favorite books, actually. It's really, I don't even know how I found it. I think I found it. I was like hanging out on like peak oil forum type thing, which is amazing, old school peak oil shit. Amazing. Like, just the sort of like nexus of like gold bugs, like early Bitcoin people, peak oil. Oh God, that was good internet. But anyway, so this guy, it's about the 90s in Russia. It's basically about the collapse of the USSR and then the rise, kind of the beginning of the rise of Putin. And the whole thing is very interesting because it focuses specifically on contracts. Like, you need an authority to adjudicate a contract. Sorry, code is not law. It's like, dude, breaking your legs if you don't pay is law. But code can be contract, but it cannot be law in the full sense, in my opinion. But basically, it talks about how, the USSR fell apart and the court system obviously also fell apart and it became like, if anything, its own kind of just like rogue power, right? That would just, like you see this in a lot of like third world countries where it's kind of like just essentially a kidnapping ring or something where it's like you can get arrested for nothing and then you pay a fine and you get out. It's not actually like useful. I mean, value neutral. It's just not useful for enforcing contracts, right? So what kind of entered the breach there was the mafia. It was like the literal mafia in Russia, because they have these organized crime networks that are pretty well developed, and they become the kind of like guarantor of different contracts in their area. So it's like they have an incentive to like be good, adjudicators of contracts so that they get more people that are doing contracts in their area. You can see where this is going. So basically the organized crime kind of like enters the breach there. And then his whole point is like, that's like, when through like, oh, Putin's a mafioso. It's like, well, in some ways that's true, because what he did was regularize a lot of those guys. And when he tried to rebuild the state, he had to include them, right? There's really no way they're not going to be totally cut out. Anyway, it's a long way of saying that, like, that's an example of hardness going away, right? And I think that you see that in our own country now, right? Where the hardness of the legal system is belief in its impartiality. That is the hardness, right? And if everyone turns on the news and half of the whole country watches the news and goes, Donald Trump is being put through a kangaroo court, that erodes faith in the legal system. That eats away at the hardness that has been, built over hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's kind of crazy to think about that people are so willing to, throw that away. But this is another example where it's like, we, Web3, DeFi, whatever, don't have to compete with hardness as it existed in 1940. We have to compete with hardness as it exists today, which is pretty soft.
Yeah. What we're doing is vastly superior in terms of like impartiality. And it's very clear, laid out, open source enforcement of things. But I agree with all that. And I also add, the only difference between a mafia and a state is how impartial its rules seem. Like, it's still like a violence and power hyperstructure that's imposing its laws on you. But the state is just a benevolent, a more benevolent, less nepotistic, biased version of that. And that's why we have a trust and belief in it, and it gets like typically collective support of people. And the more you lose that impartiality, I think the more it devolves into a mafia type setting where it's like, for my friend's enemy, for my enemy's the law. Type of structure. And I definitely think we're segueing towards that. It's the legal system is beginning to be weaponized. It's beginning to be heavily politicized. It's also guys like Soros sponsoring DA, district attorneys things. It's like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, you're literally undoing the basic fabric. I mean, he knows what he's doing. I know he knows what he's doing. No other reason to try to not subvert that unless you know what you're trying to gnaw away at in a very deep, like substantive substrate kind of way. And when you erode that, and when the collective trust is abandoned there, and when people don't think decisions are fair, I mean, you just have a prime situation for a new system to come to light.
Yeah, I mean, and that's really, I think that's the opportunity. I mean, just like George Soros is great for DeFi. In some ways, all this stuff is that's the accelerationist take, right? That's kind of interesting because, like, the belief in the system is its main thing, right? And this is something that you see so often. And I think about this with DeFi and crypto adoption and all this stuff. It's like words only go so far in terms of telling people about what could happen if they don't do this stuff, keeping their own. I mean, imagine any crypto talking point that's been tried sometimes the plane has to run into the mountain for people to understand that the plane can run into the mountain. You see that, and I think that looking back on this, speaking about Urbit, speaking about crypto, speaking about just whatever this whole, Web3 generally defined thing is, it's like COVID was a blessing, man. Because I think it's like it radicalized so many boomers who were just like, can see with their own eyes censorship at all these levels, right? At the informational level, at the financial level. And it makes it very visceral for people that didn't consider themselves necessarily to be dissident frog, anon post, right? Just normal people. I think we'll look back at that as a sort of like great awakening, in my opinion, for all this stuff. And the ripple effects, I think, are still being felt.
Yeah, and that's part of what goes into turnings, too, is apparently like slow loss of trust and belief in previous institutions. Because, frankly, the new people, because there's a refresh of humanity every 80-ish years, they weren't around to build those institutions. They're not their institutions, so they don't care about them as much. And I think you're seeing that lack of dedication to belief in those systems more and more, unfortunately, especially with their blatant politicization. And like you said, that is a benefit for us. We're crypto succeeding is weird because obviously I want it to succeed, but its success kind of relies on, the other system exposing itself as corrupt and not worth maintaining. And you need to remove people out of these situations as much as possible. And I absolutely think that'll be exposed more and more. And that's why things like Urbit and DeFi and all of that is inevitable.
Just a matter of time.
I do think there's, it can't be kind of ignored that many people just sort of operate under these inherited beliefs, whether they were part of the build or witnessed the build, they still believe in this bullshit, and I think something that Urbit has, I don't know if I could say struggle with, but
no. It's a propaganda show.
no struggles here. It's like the idea of there can basically, how do you harden yourself? How do we harden ourselves against the inevitable challenge that this is going to be a long road, and that we, in some ways, probably are going to have to wait until the plane really crashes into the mountain? And how do you not sort of cannibalize yourself in the process? Because it takes a lot of wherewithal,
That's true.
Yeah, the people building this have to really believe in it. But I definitely think this industry has a critical mass of that are inspired by this on a spiritual level, or just a motivation that they wouldn't have elsewhere. If this industry went away, I'd be very depressed. I don't know what I'd work on. I don't want to go back to Web 2 stuff for finance, normal finance.
It's awful to even imagine that, but it's also I don't want to get a regular job. Kidding?
It's true. Where would I go? My wife's always like, no one would hire. I'm like, I honestly would just say retard in the chat day one and just get axed. I don't think I could do it.
And to draw a parallel too to the Guerilla thing, that right there illustrates what I mean when I say dominant motivation. There's another saying, a quote I reference a lot, that the army loses if it does not win. The guerrilla wins if he does not lose. If he doesn't lose,
Yeah.
So just persistence is what allows you to defeat a larger adversary. And the U.S. and all these other entities, but most of the U.S. that are trying to maintain their soft power, they're not fighting for survival. The U.S. is not in jeopardy in terms of, it might have its own issues independent of this, but soft power and SWIFT and sanctions and the petrodollar are not the bulwark of the U.S. continuing to exist. They allow certain privileges that have been a double-edged sword in some respects, but definitely mostly on net very positive. But, they'll lose some economic advantages and be less able to, impose gay marriage in Afghanistan. But they're not dying. It's not going to end them. They'll kind of be like the UK with the Second Amendment when they lose this battle eventually.
Yeah.
There are worse things. And so that's why the state is not fighting for its survival. It's fighting for control over soft power. It fought very hard to get it. Won World War II to get there. And then it's not going to go silently or play by the rules to maintain that. But when it does, it's not going to be destroyed. Whereas what we're fighting for is more of a genuine belief. When guerrillas fight for their homeland, the Viet Cong or the Taliban, I'm sorry, that's their home. Whether or not you agree with them politically or anything like that, they persist and stay there because that's where they live. They're not going away. They'll fight it out as long as they need to. And I view our motivations there similar. The U.S. is fighting for political control and some economic privileges that it won't die if it loses. In this industry, and a lot of the people here are genuinely fighting for something they believe in. I think the other side can fight for far, far, far longer than give me credit empirically, when it's actually fighting for like with religious motivation, the other side is fighting for convenience and some economic benefit.
And I don't even think it's true. It's like religious. Like this is just like who you hang out with. That's the way I would put it. It's almost not even religious. Just like who else would I talk to on the internet? You know what I mean? And like work with than like urban motherfuckers or like all the. It's like I just don't have any interest in being part of any other thing. Those are the people. We're the people that are going to get this over the line. Not someone who's like, yo, I got like this 8 zillion FDV, 5% float, Ponzi scheme out there. I don't even think it harms it that much. Honestly, it's just like a distraction. That's the thing I kind of like against.
All of these regulators and deep state types, they're not fighting for their survival or something they genuinely believe in. They're bureaucrats taking out orders in this like political state hyperstructure that's just kind of advancing its own interest. But when it loses, like, I'm sorry, all those guys still have jobs. They're not like gone. They're not fighting for survival in any real way on an individual level. And these aren't, the people who work for the state. These are not, these are not like high integrity people. I just don't think they are. I also don't think they're high. I don't think they're, the best and the brightest. They're not sending their best. I just don't think
like mushrooms. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, they're cog people fundamentally, and I don't think they're threatened on a personal level by this. The state, the entity they represent is, but when they lose, they still go home. They're fine. Like if we were to lose, we lose like a form of our identity.
Can you imagine this like alternative world where there's like a punished Dimitri? You know what I mean? And with like an eye patch, and he works at the SEC. And it's more than a job for him. You know what I mean? Like he lives in an apartment, the True Detective apartment. He's, just got the crucifix on the wall, or I don't know, whatever. and the mattress. And every day he gets up, he's like, I'm going to fuck these Web3. I'm going to just destroy them all. Maybe he's out there.
He's got his shed with like his all stuff thrown up. And
exactly. You're hiding DeFi front ends under your floorboard, aren't you?
If they were genuinely composed of all that type of guy, like, hey, it'd be a little different than the
exactly. Exactly. All right. Well, we've been yapping for a long time. Let me see if anybody here has questions. Actually, Roslet, you get first cut on the questions.
No, let's open it.
Open it up. All right. All you people.
Yeah.
We've been doing all the talking here, sucking up all the oxygen. Y'all got any questions for my man Dimitri here at DeFi? Energetic vortices, Urbit, anything like that?
Hey, I have a question. I probably just missed the whole breakdown at the beginning, but like, is there like an integration that you're doing with like liquidity stuff on Urbit?
So what we're focusing on now on the Urbit side is we're focusing on things that are totally on chain right now. And so we did the Uniswap one. We have one for Vega that should be coming out in the next couple days. And then actually Dimitri has been helping us out, like find kind of high value DeFi projects that we can also do. But it's pretty nice. The Laconic, who's Rick Dudley's outfit, has been helping us with this to make sure that it's very easy to validate that your Urbit is running the latest front end from the official project GitHub. So you can kind of like validate that it's not being you're not being man in the middle. But yeah, that's the main thing that we've been working on.
So like in terms of bringing that to like a Urbit native experience, like once you have the front end, a lot of the bulk of that is done, right? At that point, the wallet itself might not be on Urbit.
Yeah, that's the thing that we're still always we're waiting until we get everything audited and like the tires have been kicked, etc. There's going to be some stuff that you're going to want to not be putting your keys, for example, into your Urbit until we have validated that stuff, until that work's finished. But yeah, I mean, that is the plan, right? Is that we start with hosting the front end, and then we can move on to deeper integrations, maybe even integrations even at the browser level, and then just kind of like work from there, work from the front end to the back end, basically.
Okay, sweet. Thanks for, repeating what you already said, probably.
Absolutely.
But I don't know, people come in later, so.
Oh, absolutely. And we're going to actually, we have a few announcements about that stuff that we will be tweeting about, I think, tomorrow. We have a video of how to set everything up and stuff, so just watch out for that. Kenny.
Hey, guys. So just wanted to get some comments, Dimitri, from you from kind of like news from today. So last week, I think there was a repeal made it through Congress for some, arbitrary accounting rules that the SEC didn't ask anybody to put in, and which made it really difficult for banks to hold crypto on their balance sheets, or very expensive anyway. And that got repealed with 60 senators signing up for this. This is pretty bipartisan. Chuck Schumer, for example, voted for the repeal. Not quite enough to overturn a veto by the president, which he said he would, but he has not done so yet. And now today, where we're getting rumors that it looks like possibly the Ethereum ETF is going to happen, are these just small, like, tactical wins that are sort of happening? Or maybe when the center falls, is it going to fall like Afghanistan fell when we left, and it just happened over a weekend? Or is this going to be like a slow progression of things where they just sort of give up over many months and years?
Yeah, and that's good framing, because like when I frame stuff or speak on it, I have come to learn I have a much longer chart than most people tend to speak on it. It's not so long that it becomes too abstract to even be useful, but like the day-to-day stuff, like you just described, I would almost reference that the same way as like when Brexit happened in 2016 or the 1984 election with Reagan, which was like every state pitch red. Imagine saying it's going to get so gay and woke 10, 15 years from now and all that. And like, you'd be like, are you crazy? It's super like, fuck hippies. This is crazy. Like, look at the energy going on here. But, there are impulses of energy that push Cthulhu back right, here and there. Like, it's not one smooth swim. I think that both politically, I also think that with DeFi, anything politically, which is to say DeFi too, which is inherently political. And some of these stuff, like both those things you just described to me, one, allowing banks to hold crypto, like, behooves the state if it understands this appropriately. It maybe helps our bags a little bit. If you're like, how does this help us? It helps us because maybe price action, because they get to buy some. But fundamentally, like, them owning it is not really the product. It's just a price action thing. The ETF is kind of the same thing. It just lets normies buy ETH more, but not even in a real way, not in a way that's crypto related. They own an asset that tracks ETH and has a bunch of ETH in it that is held in a wallet owned by a bank that the feds can seize at any time, that they probably have the private keys to, frankly. So it's like, there's no power structure there. Like, if anything, the power structure is a little bit towards corporations and banks, letting them hold those things. So I think that kind of on it helps them. It maybe helps us, and by virtue of it helping our bags. I think the far more impactful stuff is what happened with the Tornado dev and what's happening with privacy tech, where it's just going to be, I think it's going to be flat out banned, period. They're not even going to pick like Railgun and all these other things that are already privacy tech. They're just going to say, if you use Monero, that is whatever the name of the acronym is, I forget, a violation of sanctions, something like that. If there was something that happened that like fundamentally stopped that, that would be the kind of thing that would make me change my tune. Or Ethereum nodes and validators are never to be considered money transmitters. And those will never be deemed, KYC for Uniswap is antithetical to the system. So ergo, we are outlawing it. That would make me change my pitch a little bit. I'd be like, wow, because that's a little bit of soft power we lost when that happens. Like, the things you just described to me have nothing to do with soft power at all. They're like accounting things based in part by some boomers having some conflicting opinions, probably on bank risk, and having to do with stuff that helps price action near term. I don't think it does anything like infrastructure-wise or foundationally for DeFi in a positive or negative way. I just think it's price action stuff mostly.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree. And maybe the last part of that question, though, is this a kind of a slow slog over many months and years, or could it be one of those things where it's a long conflict and ends abruptly, or is it just doesn't really matter?
Oh, I'm very much slow slog. Like, I don't think there's going to be one nail in the coffin event in either way. I think it'll happen, the aggression will happen piecemeal and incrementally, and then the loss will be the same. Like, for instance, I expect the U.S. to eventually abandon its citizenship taxation. That'll probably be a big sign that the war is sort of ending and that they're starting to realize, okay, like, we're not the man in the room anymore. Certain things being adopted probably by Russia and China, who will adopt it more to hurt the U.S. than to help DeFi. Like, certain competitive states with the U.S. really pushing for it and not understanding it, like maybe infrastructure-wise will be one of those things. And not all of them, by the way. I know China and Russia have been kind of anti-DeFi initially, and I'm not making bets on them changing, but like some states will. And then I think the U.S. capitulates in a piecemeal fashion. Like it maybe stops prosecuting devs as much. Maybe you get some certain convictions being overturned. And the citizenship taxation probably getting abandoned, I think, is how it maybe ends. And then the U.S. starts to like become a powerful, normal nation and not like the superpower I tell everyone what to do thing. But I don't think it's like a single event that is like dropping the nuke on Japan or kind of thing that ends it.
All right, Sarlev.
Yo. All right, so my question's around our boomer friends who've gotten
Is this me?
their eyes opened. Well, yeah, a little bit. Spiritual boomer.
I'm a boomer whisperer. I'm pro boomer, so just be careful what you say.
I'll be the YC shill, make things easy, things slick, make things fast. But really, the question goes to if we go with the guerrilla warfare analogy, we're starting to win on hearts and minds with the spiritual boomers, but they aren't yet actually particularly useful, or kind of using our infrastructure as opposed to kind of legacy regime infrastructure. What do you see as the driver, not just to general awareness, but practical adoption of the elder generation for DeFi?
Honestly, making it extremely easy. The friction just has to be lower, a lot lower. How hard is it to set up an account at Fidelity kind of thing? And also a big part too will be things like self-custody. That's tough. Some of these guys care about that, but I don't think almost any of them want to deal with the fact that if they, get phished, it's gone. So stuff like account abstraction is actually probably really important, because some of the stuff needs to be recoverable if a boomer gets phished or whatever, because, with great responsibility, with great, sovereignty comes great responsibility, but I don't think a lot of people are prepared to handle that. So having systems in place to dramatically lower the friction, because realizing how non-tech native a lot of these boomers are, and then having some kind of fallback for some of this stuff if they fuck up, that it's not tough, too bad. Things around hacks as well probably need to be firmed up a bit more. That's a tough one because the state needs to have involvement for the enforcement of that to happen, and that's a tough one to navigate. But fundamentally,
is the argument there for reintroducing middlemen? Would you say hey, this is actually a service that middlemen do provide that is valuable and desirable by the market?
Yeah, probably. But if those middlemen are multi-sig stuff to give you a fallback, that's way cheaper than a banking middleman, or some of the other stuff that was human instantiated before that. That's how there needs to be some fallback stuff that helps them not be so, in a foreign territory that's so you're on your own. I think if those things start to get adopted or easily accessible, to the point too, where getting to the point where most people don't even know what chain they're on necessarily, because I don't think boomers will care. I don't think.
Oh, that'd be amazing.
That's a big thing. I wrote about this a long time ago, where I think a sign that we're ready for. The boomer population is the same way where you use Netflix, you don't know what cloud provider they use. I have no idea if they use Azure or AWS, and I don't care what service I'm getting. And when DeFi gets to that level, then I think the normies really come, because that to me would suggest the friction is so low and the accessibility is right there that it's easy for the people who are on or politically with us, but they're not willing to go. People are very lazy and they're not willing to go through friction and learning new things. When we get to that point, I think we'll probably be able to onboard a lot more normie core types that, again, are not really ideologically driven as much, but more convenience based. And hey, they like the ideology too, but they're not willing to die for it or go through a whole new thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's always, I think, been sort of the core of the Urbit as UX abstraction over various DeFi infrastructure narratives, because really, there's no reason anyone should know. I should never hear the word optimism. I don't even know. Someone's you need ETH on optimism. I'm get fucked. There's just no, there's just no way. I can barely understand it. You know what I mean? So it's something that just does all that for you. And really something that is a computer is the only way that will work, right? And if it's going to be decentralized and each person's going to have their own, then basically you've reinvented Urbit a little bit, because I think that it is ultimately all these adoption things are a UX issue just depends on how broad you construe the UX, right? It's like a bank is a UX, right? I mean, like everything is a user experience. So
yeah. That's a non-trivial thing too. It's like, it's critical. Like,
oh yeah,
that
absolutely.
like, onboarding and the steps, like it's unbelievably critical. It's not some afterthought thing. I think that's a folly too of a lot of DeFi types who inherently tech. It means, all right, everyone should show up now. It's like
no.
Yeah.
Well, I think also it's just like that. That's also there's got to be some name for the fallacy where you like don't give your enemies enough credit. You know, it's sort of like there's an idea that a lot of these middlemen and intermediaries are there purely through the malice of the intermediary. But like a lot of them actually start as just, it's important to have a convenience layer. You know, people don't want to keep their gold bars under their bed. So there are legitimate things that, you know, you have to account for. And one of them is not having to know that your ETH is on Arbitrum versus Optimism, you know.
When they get to the cloud comparative point, that'll be very bullish.
Yeah, I love that idea. It's like, do you want to watch Netflix on Azure or on GCP? It's like, what?
Yeah, I don't fucking care. Yeah.
That's a great analogy. Okay, we're running out of time here. I don't want to take too much of your time. Does anyone have any other questions for our man here? We go, Bantus. There he is.
Hey, I have a question for Dimitri. So I'm wondering if you think about Urbit at RabbitX specifically, if you'd ever consider building a front end on Urbit or anything else.
Yeah, we definitely would. I remember I spoke with some Urbit guys about that a bit ago. We're a DYDX v3 model right now, which means like you can't see the transactions on Etherscan. Like the order book is off chain and the sequencing is off chain. We're working to bring that on chain in our v4. And when we exist on an on chain network, probably on StarkNet, then that would make more like sovereign sense, right? And that you can access us independent of our front end. But we would have to get there for that to make a more sovereign access point, so to speak.
Yeah, awesome. That's all I got.
Okay, well, this has been really, really great, Dimitri. Always a real pleasure hanging out with you. Everyone, go follow Dimitri. Is your stuff pinned? You used to have like a really nice organization for some of your work on your account, Dimitri.
Used to. What happened?
I haven't checked in a while. Yeah.
I have one piece pinned. I mean, I move everything to the Substack eventually, which is also my profile. And then if you go to highlights, that's where probably all the core stuff, you'd find that there. There's a fair amount in highlights. There's a couple in articles I'm starting to use, but it's mostly highlights. And then the Substack is a nice way where it's all consolidated there too. And I'm working to refine stuff and putting it on there.
Beautiful. Yeah, I encourage everyone to read it. It's super interesting stuff. Gotten me a lot more interested, I think, in the kind of theory and social stuff of DeFi, or the kind of, the history of it. I found it very fascinating. So go ahead and read that. We are, Urbit stuff. We're going to be shipping front end for Vega. We have the Uniswap one out. We're shipping one for Vega tomorrow. And we're going to be trying to ship out one of those every couple of weeks for the next, indefinite future. We also have a developer technical focus con in Georgia, undisclosed lake in Georgia. It's going to be very fun. These are cool events. They're pretty much for people that are contributors, but that could be a contributor in the broadest sense of the term. So if you write code, if you are contributed to Urbit in any way, go ahead and go to @Urbit. There's a lot of tweets about it, and sign up for that. It's going to be a lot of fun. Deadline is the end of this month to apply.
And Talon is hiring.
Oh, and Talon is hiring. Dang.
What are you guys hiring for?
We got an SRE, a product engineer. We got a few different things. Systems engineer. Looking for people with a lot of experience.
Blood boy.
Yeah.
Actually, Galen's birthday today, so I don't know. He's getting old. He's probably
needs
that blood boy stat.
Yeah, he needs to start changing out.
The 1,000-year computer. This is serious, dude.
That'd be a great network for Urbit, like a blood boy network. Like it's just completely Urbit native.
Dude, that would be so. Someone should do like a meme. It's like Galen in the Harkonnen, kind of like in the vat of black goo. That's kind of the Galen Wolf Polly, king of Urbit.
It's like the viscous Galen.
Okay, well, that's enough of that. Okay, great talking to everyone.
Thanks
for
Dimitri.
coming, Dimitri. Great talking to you. I'll see you soon, man. Peace.